Here at the front of the house, there was actually an 1840s edition that looked very similar to this, except they had an upstairs window here. About 1890 or so, that began to fall apart. His mother got rid of that. That's when she added in the new 1893 edition. So.
And what kind of inspired Jesse to start fighting?
Well, I think, and you'll have to come back sometime when you can see the video and everything, but, this was the Missouri-Kansas border warfare. There was just a lot of stuff going on. When he was about 15 years old, his stepfather, some of the local Union soldiers came, they took his stepfather and they hung him from a coffee bean tree out here in the yard, trying to get him to tell where Frank was located. Frank was actually out here in the woods with Quantrell's raiders at that point. They strung his stepfather up about 3 times. He didn't die, but he did lose oxygen to the brain. Jesse was a kid out plowing the field. They said they went out there, they got a hold of him, they whipped him, they got him back down here, and they said he had blood streaks going, down his back. So I think, much as anything, it was a lot of anger, feeling like he, and when they came home, because he had been a guerrilla, they couldn't, preach, teach, hold office. I mean, I think maybe had Lincoln lived, maybe things would have been a little different, but the Confederates were, especially the bushwhackers were kind of held down, so.
And apparently Frank James was saying that Jesse was at the Centralia battlefield.
I think they both were there. Mm-hmm.
Do you believe his brother when he says that Jesse pulled the trigger on the major there?
He may have. I mean, of course, I don't know for sure, but that could have been. I've been to that battlefield, and that's something to see. Have you been there?
Yeah, we just got through there.
Did today?
Yeah.
Oh, isn't that the eeriest place?
In 1864, in the state of Missouri, the Confederate forces were experiencing heavy losses in territory. So, towards the middle of that year, the officers in the Confederate Army were ordered to wage more or less a partisan or guerrilla war, and Bloody Bill Anderson was put in charge of dozens of these troops. He and his men, 80 of them, dressed in Union uniforms, invaded a town, cut the railroads, and got drunk off of stolen whiskey. As a train approached, they surrounded it and asked an officer to come forward, and they identified themselves as Confederate partisans. Now, this officer, who was a sergeant, he steps forward expecting to be killed instantly. Rather, they allowed him to live, and then they forced the rest of the 24 Union men on the train to undress, get completely nude, they scalped them, and then they shot them. And then another man in town organized a regiment of about 147 volunteers to take on Bloody Bill himself. Now, the major of this regiment was a school teacher before the war. He had no training. And because his regiment was using muzzle loaders and Bloody Bill's men were using 6-shooters, he suffered 100 losses out of the 147 people with him. And it was said later by Frank James, the brother of the infamous outlaw, Jesse James, that it was Jesse who shot the major in the head himself, execution style.
This is the part that Jesse would have remembered here. Right here, this first room here, that would have been his mother's bedroom there. And when you look inside, you're going to see that the bed is at kind of an odd catty-cornered angle. And the reason for that, they were so afraid of grave robbers. And if you look out here, that was the original gravesite. And his mother actually had her bed positioned where day or night she could keep track of the gravesite. She also had a loaded gun by the door, shoot to scare, shoot to kill. If anybody messed with her boy's grave, she was going to see to it that he was protected, even in death. So,
were there people trying to come by and tear it down? Was there anger?
I think that was their fear. And then when they did move him into Kearney to Mount Olivet Cemetery in 1902, the souvenir hunters came along, chipped away at the original 8-foot marker, a monument, and what's left of it is in our museum, about 3 foot of it. So, can you imagine being that creepy?
And this is the grave, or the original grave, of Jesse James. And we've already heard a little bit of his history. And the story goes that a member of his own gang decided to collect on the bounty, and while Jesse was dusting off some needlework, the guy sneaks up and shoots him in the back, basically. He was a coward. He was named Bob Ford. And over in Richmond, about 30 miles east of here, 2 years later, because everybody called him a coward and a traitor, he killed himself. And then apparently his father went over to open up a saloon in Colorado, and somebody comes in, and he's from Missouri, and he says, "Hey, Bob." And Bob says, "Hey," gets shot just like Jesse James got shot. So, and this gravestone faces, if you want to pan around and show the original Jesse James home site there, his mother would have kept watch from that room there, the farthest to the right before you get to the white side. As we heard back at Jesse James's birthplace, he really gained traction in the partisan movement after they tried to hang his father and they were chasing his brother, Frank James. And so Jesse went into Frank James's partisan unit and began fighting with Quantrill. And after the Civil War ended, he continued fighting up until the 1868 when he formed the James Younger Gang. He teamed up with Cole Younger, and they began launching raids everywhere from here up to the northernmost part of the U.S. They were all over the eastern part of the states, and the gang ended with the capture of the Younger brothers in 1876 at the failed robbery of the Minnesota Bank. And in 1882, one of his own gang members snuck up behind him and shot him in the back. And this has become since a very infamous moment in outlaw history, but this ended the end of the partisan activity. And in fact, they believe that that robbery up in Minnesota, several people call it the end of the Civil War, or the end of the Confederacy, because Jesse James, Frank James, and the Cole Younger Gang, and the James Younger Gang, they were still active partisans from the Civil War that never laid down their arms.
That's the room where the Pinkerton bomb took place. That's where the little half-brother was killed and the mother lost her right arm in there. And if you want to look in there, you sure can. And the window, and you can't go in, but you'll do they're not letting us take people in. The window that looks out toward the outhouse, that was the location of where the Pinkertons threw the bomb in, right there. On the fireplace, the mantle is original, the rock is not. But Jesse's little half-brother, 8-and-a-half-year-old half-brother, he was killed in there at that time. The mother had her arm around him, they said, trying to protect him when the explosion happened. His stepfather threw the bomb into the fireplace. He didn't have any idea it was going to be any kind of explosive. He just thought it was a fireball. He throws it in, it explodes. Jesse's mother, from what I understand, was standing with her arm around the little boy trying to protect him. So when that happened, she took the hit in the right arm. He took the hit in the abdominal area, bled to death several hours later. So, and then first they amputated up to her wrist, gangrene set in. Eventually they had to amputate up to the elbow. And in fact, if you look, and how well you can tell it, but if you look at that picture there, you can see her sleeve is just hanging there.
Bloody Bill Anderson is one of the most fascinating partisans in the Civil War, and he was really a folk hero for a long period of time. And the story goes that his family lived down in Kansas, and his father was murdered by a pro-Union judge, and he vowed revenge, so he began riding with Quantrill's raiders. Quantrill was one of the guys that was leading the partisan activity into Kansas, launching border raids even before the Civil War began, and killing people who were pro-Union activists. And, Bloody Bill decided to join him because he wanted to get back at the man who killed his father. He killed the judge and joined him,
And after a little while, the Union Army took in Bloody Bill's sisters and put them in a hastily built jail. And this jail was so hastily built that it fell over, killed one of his sisters, and maimed another one. So again, his vengeance was renewed, and he decided to launch the Centralia massacre, but not before turning to Confederate authorities and claiming that Quantrill himself was a war criminal, claiming that he murdered men, which in reality both of them did, but Quantrill was separated from him, and William Anderson became the most feared partisan in this part of the country. And he was going around massacring people, and when the invasion by the Confederate Army happened from the north of the state, they wanted to recapture the state of Missouri, they allowed him to command dozens of troops, and they demanded that he act in ways of guerrilla warfare, partisan warfare. And he launched a number of small-scale battles, one of which resulted in 11 dead Union troops and 3 black porters, who were very most likely executed. And in retaliation, the Union killed 6 of his men who had already surrendered. So again, this guy, he's on revenge after revenge after revenge. It's not a war for politics for him, it is a very personal war. And so he vows revenge and launches the Centralia massacre, which to this day it's marked as a battlefield. It was a massacre. He and 80 men show up into Centralia dressed in Union clothing. They claim to be Union troops, they cut the railroad line, they steal all the whiskey, get incredibly drunk, which is very bad when an army comes into your town and gets drunk because you know what's going to happen. They're dulling their emotions for what's to follow. They board a train with 25 Union soldiers on it, make them get naked, and they call up one officer and they say, "Come forward, an officer." And this man stood up expecting that he would be killed and made an example of, but in an act of sheer brutality, Quantrill and his men scalp and then murder 24 other people who had already surrendered. And in the wake of this, somebody sends in 147 people led by someone who was a major in the Civil War, but before that he was a school teacher, no training at all. In he comes with 147 people armed with muzzle loaders, while Quantrill and his men have 6-shooters. So only 3 of Quantrill's troops died in that raid. 123 Union men died. Many of them had surrendered. Now, the monuments over at Centralia still mark the bravery and patriotism and loyalty of the Confederacy. In reality, this war was so brutal in this part of the country. It was partisan, it was guerrilla warfare, and Quantrill, or rather William Anderson himself, he died only a month later after gaining a level of infamy that was unmatched among the partisans operating in this part of the world.